Welcome to another frightening and macabre episode of the strange and unexplained phenomena of the South Mountains of North Carolina. I am your host, Kaiser Rebel. Tonight, I'm going to share with you a series of experiences that a family had in Burke County, North Carolina, from the late 1940s on into the 1960s. And this series of events, these ghost stories that was shared with me, are by far the most frightening ghost stories that I have ever personally been told in my life. So, that being said, grab you a cup of coffee, turn down your lights, and join me for episode 17, part 1, The Hag in the Ground. Now, I met a lady, an elderly lady, a while back, and at first she looked familiar, but as it turned out, we didn't know one another. And we struck up a conversation. And during the conversation, I mentioned this show, the one you're watching now. And she wanted to know about it. And she looked at me and she said, I grew up near the South Mountains. Do you collect ghost stories as well? I said, yes, ma'am. I've collected a number of experiences surrounding ghosts. She said, when we have time, I would like to tell you some experiences my family had as I was growing up. And so over the next few weeks, by email, Miss Connie, her real name, shared with me her family's horrifying and long journey in the supernatural. Now, her parents were not from the South Mountains. After World War II, her father got out of the military and they were living in eastern North Carolina, and they decided to move to the western North Carolina foothills. And they bought an old farmhouse with acreage. Got a pretty good deal on it. And a few months later, Miss Connie was born, the first of two girls. And this old farmhouse was the only home that Connie would know until she was 23 years old, at which time she moved and left the area. But after Miss Connie was born, her mother battled what we now call postpartum depression. And Connie's father later confided in her later on in life that he felt that whole time that a dark cloud just sat over the family's head, that a dark cloud just sat over the household and even over the property. The local doctor didn't have much to offer. They weren't very adept back then at treating things like this. Now, as sort of a foreshadowing, I'll mention that her parents had a conversation with a couple after church one day. And this couple, the lady of the couple, would go on to become Miss Connie's mother's best friend. And shortly into the friendship, the lady mentioned to Connie's mother, she said, it's too bad that we don't have the old root doctors around like they used to back in the old days. Now, let me explain that real quick. A root doctor can mean different things to different people, but at its base, a root doctor was a person who had the knowledge and skill at knowing plants and how to use those plants to treat disease and illness. Now, other people usually ascribe a mystic quality to the figure of root doctor. The kind of mysticism of a witch or a seer, a person who could tell the future, that kind of thing. And she mentioned it, of course, because she knew what Connie's mother was suffering from. Now, within a few days, Connie's mother began to have the same horrifying dream over and over. In this reoccurring dream, Connie's mother would be in their backyard walking to the well to get water. As she would get close, an old, very scary looking woman would come up out of the well and would approach her with her arms outstretched, her bony and aged fingers as if they was beckoning her to come closer. And at the end of every one of the times that she had that dream, the old hag would say, I must rest, or you and yours never will. She had that same dream repeatedly over a period of several months. And Connie's mother and father at the time noted that at night, baby Connie would wake up with the most hysterical and loud crying outside of the realm of normality for an infant. And it sounded to them not that she was hungry or wanted to be picked up, but it sounded to them like that the child was terrified. 2 years later, Connie's little sister Edith was born, and the same cycle began again. Connie's mother began having that same bad dream. The new infant, Connie's little sister, would wake up at night crying just like Connie did when she was an infant. And things once again seemed to subside to some degree, but strange things would happen inevitably from time to time. When Miss Connie was around 8 years old, she was awakened not by a dream, but by a horrifying experience. Now, at this point, Connie's parents, though she was on up into grammar school age, they had not shared any of the information about the bad dreams to the girls. And that certainly hadn't offered any explanation from some of the strange and weird unexplained things that had happened around the house, and doors shutting by themselves, hearing a voice from time to time, and that kind of thing. They never offered an explanation. They didn't talk about it to Connie at all. But Connie awakened one cold winter night in her bedroom and saw an entity, an old, frail-looking, bent-over woman coming out of the fireplace in her room. And Miss Connie told me, she said, I have never forgot one single detail about the way that ghost looked or how afraid I was. And during this experience, the old woman came toward her with her arms reaching out toward Connie. And Connie said she wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She sat up in bed, but couldn't get anything out of her mouth, that she felt like she couldn't even breathe. And that old lady got close to her and put her finger up to her mouth, shushing her. And the entity said, I must rest, or you and yours never will, and then disappeared. Connie regained her voice, screamed for her father, and this same experience would happen several more times over the next week or so. And up to that point, the family had certainly not spoke of these things to any outsider except for the very intimate and private conversations between Connie's mother and her best friend. And an event about 2 years later would lead Connie's father to finally reach out to an external source for some help. So he reached out to a pastor. And Connie's one close friend in the area came one day to spend the day quilting with her. And Connie's mother told her everything and spared nothing. She had apparently up to then been holding back some, but she told her everything that had gone on. And Connie's friend looked at her and she said, do you remember when I mentioned the root doctors that they had in the olden times? And Connie's mother said yes. And she said, well, there is a story that has been handed down. And it's a story that involves the very backside of the property that you and your husband now own. And she went on to say that living in an old cabin, well away from the main yard of the house, was an old woman. She was not related to the property owners at the time, pre-1900, but she was allowed to live there because she offered a very valuable service. She was not highly esteemed, and most people were frightened of her, but she was allowed to live there because she was a very accomplished root doctor. We will pick up there in part 2 of this episode. I appreciate you all.